She's been asleep for years without even knowing it. In Heartland Season 20, Episode 1, Amy Fleming finally opens her eyes to a truth she's been avoiding since the day she lost Ty. But what if that dream wasn't just a dream at all? Something shifted in the final moments of Heartland Season 19, and it wasn't just one storyline wrapping up. It was the entire emotional foundation of the show quietly cracking open. For years, Amy's world revolved around a single, unshakable center of gravity: the ranch, her family, and the memory of the man she lost. But Season 19 ended by asking a question the show has never fully dared to ask before. What happens when the life Amy built to survive her grief is no longer the life that fits who she's become? To understand why that question matters so much, you have to go back to how chaotic those final episodes really were. The confrontation between Jack and Wes wasn't a minor skirmish tucked into a subplot. It escalated fast, and for a moment, it genuinely felt like someone was going to get seriously hurt. Wes had spent the better part of the season proving he wasn't a man who backed down easily, and Jack, stubborn as ever, wasn't about to let a threat like that stand in his ranch without pushing back. What made the moment land so hard wasn't just the danger itself. It was watching Jack, a man who has weathered decades of hardship on that land, suddenly look vulnerable again. And then, almost out of nowhere, Peter stepped in. That single choice deserves more attention than it usually gets. Peter has never been the character fans point to first when they think about who protects the Heartland family. He's often positioned on the edges of the bigger emotional storylines, more focused on his own path than the daily battles at the ranch. But that's exactly what made his interventions so powerful. When the people he loves are actually in danger, Peter doesn't hesitate. He doesn't calculate whether it's his fight to have. He just moves. It's a small character beat, but it says something important about how Heartland defines family. It was never really about last names or who owns which piece of land. It's about who shows up when things fall apart. But if Jack and Wes represented the physical danger of that finale, Nathan represented something far more devastating, a betrayal that came from inside the family itself. For weeks, something had fell off in the ranch's financial records, small inconsistencies that didn't quite add up. Nathan, methodical and sharp when it comes to numbers, kept digging instead of letting it go. What he eventually found wasn't a bookkeeping error. It was evidence, real and undeniable, that connected his own sister, Gracie, to the cattle thefts that had been quietly draining the ranch for months. And it didn't stop there. The trail led further, revealing that Gracie hadn't acted alone. She had been working with Wes the entire time. Sit with that for a second, because it's easy to breeze past just how heavy that revelation actually is. This isn't a stranger scamming the family from the outside. This is Nathan's own sister, someone who shared his childhood, his name, his history, choosing to work against the very people who trusted her. For Nathan, that discovery wasn't just about solving a mystery. It was about grappling with the uncomfortable reality that the person closest to him by blood had made a choice that could have destroyed everything Heartland stands for. What makes this even more complicated is that Gracie isn't written as a cartoon villain. Her motivations, whatever pushed her toward Wes in the first place, remain layered with the kind of desperation and resentment that makes sense even when it's indefensible. Nathan had to hold two conflicting truths at once. His sister had betrayed people he loves, and she was still his sister.
There's no clean way to process that.
And the show doesn't pretend there is. In the aftermath, Gracie made a decision that changed the entire balance of power within the Price family. She transferred her shares of the property to Nathan. On the surface, that might read as a simple resolution, a way of settling the debt and closing the chapter. But look closer, and it's clear this moment carries far more weight than a quiet handoff of paperwork. It's Gracie relinquishing not just ownership, but her claim to a future she once had a stake in. For Nathan, it meant sudden, unexpected control over land and legacy he probably never imagined he'd be solely responsible for. But control came with a price of its own. Because even with the shares transferred, Nathan still had to face the financial wreckage left behind. Debts owed to Heartland didn't disappear just because the truth had finally come out. Someone had to make things right, and Nathan, in true form, chose to take that responsibility onto himself rather than let it linger over the family. His answer was drastic. He decided to sell his own ranch. That decision alone could have been the end of his storyline for the season, a quiet act of accountability tucked into the finale's closing minutes. But it wasn't the end. It was the beginning of something much bigger, something that would completely reshape where Amy's story goes next. Selling a ranch is never just a financial decision on this show, and Nathan's choice was no exception. Underneath the practical reasoning, something else was happening. He wasn't simply trying to close out a bad chapter and move on quietly. He was making room for something new, and that something new had a name. Amy. This is where the finale stopped being about cleaning up old messes and started pointing directly toward the future. Nathan didn't want to walk away from everything and disappear into a fresh start alone. He wanted Amy standing right there beside him when that new chapter began. And so, in a moment that instantly reframed everything that came before it, Nathan asked Amy to marry him. Take a second to think about what that proposal actually represents, because it's easy to treat it as just another romantic beat in a long-running drama. It isn't. For Amy, marriage isn't a small gesture. It's not a box to check off after a few good seasons together. Her history with love is inseparable from loss. Ty wasn't just a partner. He was the person she built an entire identity around, the person whose death reshaped how she sees safety, permanence, and risk. Every choice she's made since then has been filtered through that grief, whether she's consciously aware of it or not. So when Nathan gets down on one knee, he isn't just asking Amy to spend her life with him. He's asking her to trust the future again in a way she hasn't allowed herself to since Ty died. That's an enormous emotional leap, and it's exactly why Season 20 has so much potential to be one of the most defining stretches in the entire series. Now here's where the title of this very episode becomes impossible to ignore. Amy wakes up from a dream. On its own, that might sound like a simple visual, a soft, quiet moment to open the premiere. But dreams have never been used carelessly on this show. They tend to surface exactly what a character is too afraid to say out loud while they're awake. So, what was Amy dreaming about? Was it Ty, pulling her back toward everything she's spent years trying to hold on to? Or was it something entirely different, a glimpse of a life with Nathan that both excites and terrifies her? There's a strong possibility it's neither one in isolation, and both at once. Grief doesn't work in clean lines. It's entirely plausible that Amy's dream blurs Ty and Nathan together, forcing her subconscious to confront a question her waking mind keeps avoiding. Is moving forward with Nathan a betrayal of what she had with Ty, or is it simply what healing eventually looks like when enough time has passed? That internal conflict is likely to become the emotional backbone of the entire season. On one side sits Heartland itself, not just as a piece of land, but as a living archive of everything Amy has ever loved and lost. Every fence post, every horse she's trained, every quiet morning on that ranch carries some trace of Ty, of Jack, of her mother, of a life she didn't choose so much as inherit and then rebuild with her own hands. Leaving that behind isn't just a change of address. It's closer to leaving behind a version of herself. On the other side stands Nathan, offering something Heartland, by its very nature, can't fully give her. A blank page. A place with no ghosts, no old routines shaped by grief, no daily reminders of what she's lost. That kind of fresh start can be healing, but it can also be terrifying because starting over means Amy has to define who she is without the ranch as her anchor for the first time in her adult life. It's worth pausing here to talk about why this particular storyline lands so hard for longtime viewers. Heartland has spent nearly 2 decades building Amy's identity around resilience through place. She healed from her mother's death by staying on the ranch. She healed from Ty's death by staying on the ranch. The land has always been her constant, the one thing that didn't change even when everything else did. So the idea of her willingly walking away from it isn't just a plot twist. It's a direct challenge to the emotional formula the show has relied on for its entire run. And that raises a bigger question hovering over this whole season. Is Heartland finally signaling that healing doesn't always mean staying rooted in the same place? Sometimes moving forward requires leaving the familiar behind entirely, even when that familiar place is filled with love. If that's the direction the writers are taking Amy, it would mark one of the most mature, emotionally honest turns in the show's history, treating grief not as something you overcome by holding on tighter, but by learning when it's finally safe to let go. There's also growing conversation online about whether this season might be building towards something even larger than Amy's personal journey. Some fans have started speculating that season 20 could be setting up Heartland's final chapter altogether. To be clear, that hasn't been confirmed anywhere, and speculation like that should always be treated carefully rather than taken as fact. But it's not hard to see why the theory has picked up traction. If the show is preparing for an eventual ending, having Amy step away from the ranch to build a life with Nathan would provide an incredibly poetic, emotionally satisfying way to bring her 15-plus-year arc full circle. If Amy really is preparing to step back from the center of Heartland, the show needs someone ready to carry that weight forward, and all signs point to Katie. Think about how far Katie has come. For most of the series, she was written as the next generation waiting in the wings, a kid growing up in the shadow of horses, heartbreak, and family legacy she didn't fully understand yet. But over the last few seasons, that's changed. She's shown flashes of independence, stubbornness that clearly runs in the family, and an instinct for the land that feels less like something she was taught and more like something that was simply always in her. If season 20 is really about transition, Katie stepping into a bigger role wouldn't just make sense narratively. It would feel earned. There's something quietly powerful about that possibility too. Heartland has always been a story about generational continuity, about how love, loss, and land get passed down even when the people carrying them change. Amy inherited that responsibility from her mother. If she eventually hands it off to Katie, it wouldn't be an ending so much as the same story finding its next narrator. The ranch keeps going. The people simply change. But none of this happens in isolation, and that's really the key to understanding why season 20 feels so significant. Every storyline from the finale is quietly feeding into this larger transition. Gracie's betrayal wasn't just about cattle theft. It forced Nathan into a position of ownership and responsibility he didn't ask for, which is exactly what put him in a position to build a future with Amy in the first place. Peter stepping in during the Jack and Wes confrontation wasn't just an isolated moment of courage. It reinforced the idea that family at Heartland has never been about bloodlines alone, which matters enormously if Amy chooses to build a new kind of family with Nathan outside the ranch's boundaries. Even Jack's vulnerability in that fight is a quiet reminder that the older generation won't be around to hold everything together forever. Someone has to be ready to take the reins, one way or another. So when you step back and look at the full picture, season 20 isn't really about one twist or one decision. It's about an entire ecosystem of characters being repositioned at the exact same time. Nathan is no longer just the guy trying to prove himself. He's a man ready to build something permanent. Gracie's arc, however uncomfortable, forced consequences that reshaped who holds power in the Price family. Katie is quietly being groomed, whether the show says so directly or not, to eventually stand where Amy has stood for years. And Amy herself is being asked the hardest question of her adult life. Can she build a future that doesn't erase her past, but doesn't require her to stay frozen in it either? That's really what this dream in the season 20 premiere seems to represent. Not a warning in the way we usually think about warnings, not some ominous sign of danger ahead, but something closer to a reckoning. A moment where Amy's subconscious finally forces her to face a truth she's been avoiding while wide awake. Maybe the dream shows her a life at Heartland that's grown a little too comfortable, a little too safe, built more out of habit than genuine choice. Or maybe it shows her a future with Nathan that feels thrilling precisely because it's unfamiliar, because for once, it isn't shaped by grief at all. Whatever that dream actually reveals, one thing feels certain heading into this new season. Amy Fleming is no longer the same woman who buried herself in ranch work just to survive losing Ty.